Picture the streets of London or maybe York in the late 1500s. I think we usually picture Shakespeare, the Globe Theatre, those giant ruffled collars, maybe Queen Elizabeth looking very majestic.
Right, the golden age of Elizabethan England.
Yeah, exactly. But if you scratch the surface, the vibe is completely different. It is paranoid. It is razor wire tense. You've got spies in the taverns, intercepting codes in the mail, and just neighbors constantly watching neighbors.
It was effectively a surveillance state.
Yeah.
Because if you fell on the wrong side of the religious divide, you weren't just a dissenter, you were viewed as a potential enemy combatant.
And today we are doing a deep dive into a story that fits perfectly into that high-stakes world. For you listening at home, we're going to look at the life of Edward Thwing.
Yes, an English Catholic priest, a scholar, and ultimately a martyr.
And we are pulling from a bunch of great sources today. We've got historical records, biographical data regarding his life and his education over in Europe, the specific laws they used to prosecute him, and the records of his ultimate execution.
The goal today isn't just to recite a biography, though.
No, exactly. We want to really examine that clash between a personal conviction and state law in the late 16th century. Though I have to admit, I am completely hooked on the spy novel elements of his story. The escapes, the hiding out, the secret missions.
Which is fascinating, but I think we also have to frame it as a really tragic study of religious and political conflict.
Fair point. Because the protagonist here isn't a soldier or some swashbuckling spy. He is a guy with a really bad knee who just wanted to read books and say Mass.
That is a very accurate, if maybe slightly understated, description of Edward.
Well, let's get into it. Let's track his life from a comfortable home in York to his end at Lancaster. Who was Edward Thwing before he became an enemy of the state?
Well, he was born around 1565. He was the second son of Thomas Thwing of Hengeworth, which is near York, and his mother was Jane Kellett.
So they weren't exactly peasants.
Far from it. This was a notable family. But beyond the money or the land, there was this heavy spiritual expectation hanging over him. He had a remarkably saintly pedigree.
Oh, right, the family connection.
Yes, he was directly related to the 14th century Saint John Thwing of Bridlington. So holiness wasn't just a casual Sunday thing for this family. It was their legacy.
That is a lot of pressure for a kid. I mean, imagine growing up and knowing your ancestor is literally a canonized saint.
It definitely sets a high bar. And growing up in the 1560s and 70s, maintaining that Catholic identity was becoming increasingly dangerous in England. If you felt a calling to the priesthood, you had a massive problem. You couldn't just enroll in a seminary. They simply didn't exist in England anymore.
Right, so you had to go into exile, which kicks off what I've been calling in my notes his European tour.
A very grueling tour. In the summer of 1583, Thwing leaves home and heads to the English college at Reims in France.
And he doesn't just stay there.
No. We can trace his movements pretty clearly through the records. He spends time with the Jesuits at Pont-à-Mousson, and then eventually travels down to Rome in 1587.
But this is where we get that really humanizing detail from the biographical data. When I picture historical martyrs, I usually imagine these unbreakable, stoic, almost marble figures. But Edward Thwing was kind of a physical wreck.
He was incredibly frail. He actually had to cut his studies in Rome short and go all the way back to Reims due to severe ill health.
And there's a specific record from November 1592 where he went to Spa, like literally the town of Spa in Belgium, specifically because he was suffering from an ulcer in his knee.
An ulcerated knee in the late 16th century would have been agonizing.
Yeah.
This is long before antibiotics or modern painkillers.
That detail just makes him feel like a real person to me. Not just a name in a history book. He probably limped everywhere. He probably had to stop and rest all the time.
But despite that physical illness, he was an absolute intellectual heavyweight. He was a reader of Greek and Hebrew. He became a professor of rhetoric and logic.
So he's a man of the mind, clearly.
Yes, and eventually he is ordained at Lyon on December 20, 1590.
Which sets up this incredible transition. You have this fragile, brilliant scholar. He's safe in Europe, but he chooses to enter a danger zone. In 1597, he is sent on the English mission.
He decides it is time to return.
And what are the immediate consequences of that? Because it doesn't go well.
Yeah, it seems he was arrested almost immediately upon returning.
Let's do a deep dive into the law here, because we need to understand the trap he walked into. What was the specific legal landscape in 1597?
He was defined heavily by the Jesuits, etc., Act of 1584. The formal citation is 27 Elizabeth I, Chapter 2.
Wait, the Jesuits, etc. Act, did they really name a law with etc.?
Well, the full title is an act against Jesuits, seminary priests, and such other, disobedient persons.
Yeah.
But yes, historians often shorten it. The rules of this act were terrifyingly simple. It gave all Roman Catholic treats 40 days to leave the country or swear an oath to obey the Queen.
And the punishment if you didn't.
Failure to comply was considered high treason.
High treason. Usually you think of treason as plotting to assassinate a monarch or selling secrets to a foreign army.
That is the crucial point here. The law framed religious existence itself as political treason. You didn't have to plot anything. By simply being a priest ordained by the Pope's authority, you were classified as an agent of a foreign enemy.
That is a total legal trap.
Absolutely. And there was collateral damage built into the law as well. Anyone harboring these priests, or even knowing of their presence and not informing the authorities, faced massive fines and imprisonment for felony.
So you could lose everything just for giving Edward a place to sleep.
Yes. So when Thwing is arrested shortly after his return, he is in the absolute worst kind of legal peril.
So they have him in custody. A frail scholar and another priest, a Dominican friar named Robert Nutter. They get sent to Wisbech Castle. Now, I looked at the historical records on this, and Wisbech is fascinating.
It is a massive paradox.
It really is. It wasn't a dungeon in the traditional sense.
No, it was a state ecclesiastical prison. But because they concentrated so many Catholic priests and dissenters there, the area effectively became a major center for English Catholicism.
The records show they were supported by Catholic alms, so they were actually relatively comfortable.
They had access to funds, books, they could debate theology.
But the detail from the sources that totally baffled me was the report by Henry Garnet. Can you explain the 5-mile rule?
Henry Garnet reported that the keeper of Wisbech actually allowed the detainees permission to move within a 5-mile radius of the castle.
I just cannot wrap my head around that. You have men locked up for high treason, the most severe crime possible, and the warden is basically saying, go stretch your legs, just don't wander too far.
It defies our modern understanding of a maximum security prison.
Why would they do that?
It was likely a mix of factors. For one, wealthy prisoners could pay for privileges. But this unique, almost relaxed environment might have been exactly what facilitated what happened next. If you give a prisoner a 5-mile leash, you were giving them the opportunity to survey the landscape, to make contacts, to plan.
And that leads right into the Great Escape. Thwing and Nutter break out of Wisbech.
They escape the 5-mile radius and vanish.
And this manhunt lasts for 3 years. They become fugitives hiding out in Lancashire.
Which was a massive stronghold for Catholic families who refused to attend the state church.
I want to focus on the tension of those fugitive years for a second. For you listening, imagine living underground for 3 solid years. You know the penalty if you are caught is death. You know the penalty for the families hiding you is ruin and prison.
The psychological toll would have been immense. Every knock on the door, every stranger in a village. And we have to remember Thwing's physical condition, the ulcerated knee. Hiding in tiny priest holes built into the walls of manor houses, cramped, in pain, completely silent, while the Queen's men searched the house.
It is the ultimate test of personal conviction.
He could have tried to flee back to the continent, but he stayed to minister to the people in Lancashire.
But the fugitive years eventually end. In May 1600, they are arrested again.
The authorities commit them to Lancaster Castle this time. No 5-mile radius walks here. They are held until the next assizes, which was the session of the traveling regional courts.
And when the trial happens, what is the actual charge read against them? Did they fabricate a plot this time?
No, they didn't even bother to fabricate a plot. The records show they were condemned quite simply for being priests. That was the entirety of the charge under the 1584 Act.
And so we reach the end of the line, July 26, 1600. Edward Thwing and Robert Nutter are executed together at Lancaster.
And we should note the method of execution, because it speaks to the state's view of their crime. They were hung, drawn, and quartered.
The absolute most severe punishment available.
It was specifically reserved for treason. It was a highly public, theatrical, and brutal method designed to obliterate the person entirely and serve as a terrifying warning to anyone else.
Which makes the epilogue to this deep dive so chilling. I want to talk about the echo of history here, looking at the family legacy.
Yes, the grandnephew.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Introduce us to Thomas Thwing.
Thomas Thwing was Edward's grandnephew.
Mm-hmm.
And 80 years after Edward's execution, in 1680, Thomas suffers the exact same fate.
80 years later, the world has changed, but the danger hasn't. What was the context for Thomas?
In 1680, England was swept up in the hysteria of the Popish plot, which was a completely fabricated conspiracy invented by a man named Titus Oates. He claimed Catholics were planning to assassinate King Charles II.
And Thomas gets swept up in an offshoot of that.
Yes, the Barnbow plot in Yorkshire. It was local paranoia feeding off the national hysteria. Thomas was accused, tried, and despite the lack of credible evidence, he was condemned.
And he was executed the same way, hung, drawn, and quartered.
Exactly the same way.
It is wild to think about that repetition of history. But both men were eventually recognized by their church, weren't they?
They were. Thomas was beatified in 1929, and Edward, our scholar with the bad knee, was beatified by Pope John Paul II in the 1980s. Sources differ slightly between 1982 and 1987, but during that decade as one of the 85 martyrs of England and Wales.
So, to summarize the journey we just took, we tracked a man who went from being a fragile professor in Europe to a fugitive living in the walls of Lancashire houses.
And the key takeaway from the historical data is that his story is a perfect snapshot of an era when the mere act of being a priest was a capital offense.
Right. It wasn't about what you did, it was about who you were.
Precisely.
Before we wrap up today, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to explore on your own. We just talked about how Edward's grandnephew met the exact same end, decades apart, under different political pretexts, but the same underlying tension.
A tragic family parallel.
Definitely. But think about Thomas growing up. He must have known the stories of his great-uncle Edward. He knew exactly how brutal the end could be. So how does family legacy shape your conviction?
That is a fascinating angle.
Does knowing the horrific danger warn you away from a path, or does the fact that your ancestor paid that ultimate price make you feel compelled to follow them? Does the legacy cement your conviction in a way that nothing else could?
It really makes you wonder if Thomas saw his uncle's life as a cautionary tale or a call to action.
Exactly. Something for you all to mull over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the historical records of Edward Thwing. We will see you next time.